Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Accelerate webinar hosted by Daniels College of Business's Executive Education Division. I'm David Worley, and I get to be your host today. These webinars are designed to help you accelerate your capacity to deliver results for your organization. Today's webinar will be roughly 25 to 30 minutes in length. We will start with a brief presentation from our faculty, and then we'll move to questions and answers a little later. For this edition, we are pleased to welcome Victor Dzirasa, an organizational consultant and affiliate professor at the Daniels College of Business. Victor teaches leading with integrity and is also an expert on a variety of other topics related to organizational leadership and development. Victor, it's so great to have you here.
Thank you, David.
Yeah. So Victor is a graduate of Hampton University in Virginia with a master's degree from Drake University in Iowa, and in addition, doctoral studies at Colorado State University right down the road in Fort Collins. Victor is the director of Innovate Change Advisory Group, where he has worked with a variety of companies, nonprofits, educational institutions, and community advocacy organizations. Victor is an expert on the cutting edge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, doing both primary research and translation work to normal people on the ground in organizations. The fruit of this careful thought and study will be illustrated in this presentation. Before I hand the webinar over to Victor, let me remind the viewers to shoot in a question at any time. And you can do so by using the question and answer section, which is Q&A at the bottom of your screen, to do so. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we can live, and if we don't get to yours, we will record an answer and include that in our follow-up email to you. So Victor, it's such a pleasure to have you, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, David. I'm really excited to be here today as well. And I think we're going to have a great discussion and some key learning insights today. Looking forward to it. So today our discussion is going to be on diversity, equity, and inclusion and how we can avoid checking the box. One of the crucial things that we want to look at when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion is understanding what the definition for diversity, equity, and inclusion is. So to begin with my presentation, I would look at a quick overview of diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of definition. So diversity can be categorized as the representation of all of our varied identities and differences, paying attention to those aspects of race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, tribe, caste, socioeconomic status, thinking, communication styles, amongst others, collectively and then also as individuals. It includes all aspects of proactively engaging, understanding, and drawing on a variety of perspectives. Equity is that fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all individuals, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate those barriers that have been preventing the participation of certain groups and causing marginalization. Inclusion involves the act of creating environments in which any individual or group can feel and be welcomed, respected, supported, and valued, and fully participate. An inclusive and welcoming climate embraces differences and offers respect in words, actions for all people. The key challenges here is how do we go about achieving something like this?
Hey, Victor, can I just interrupt you for a second to say, I don't know that the audience can see your slides.
Just a moment.
There we go. Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so
Oh,
yeah, David, can you see my slides okay now?
Yeah, I think, and I can see them, and I'm pretty confident the audience can too. Yep.
Okay, all right, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so first I would like us to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace and why it should be a priority for every organization. So there are three pillars that can be considered good pillars for corporate well-being, which would be the diversity, equity, and inclusion. But to move forward on this, we have to be aware of the distinctiveness of the abbreviation, which is the DEI. And the DEI often leads to a conflation of meanings, which makes it an all too dangerous and common practice. How do we fully understand the meaning of DEI so that we can completely implement it within an organization? First of all, I would say that diversity is a relational and contextual concept. And when we think of diversity in terms of it being relational and contextual, then we want to think of it in terms of how we can foreground diversity and how we can interrogate the different lens that interacts with diversity. We want to look at diverse groups in terms of privilege, in terms of disenfranchisement, in terms of marginalization, in terms of voices within organizations. We also want to look at it in terms of the quality of conversations that occur around diversity, being that they're powerful, positive in their nature, and then also look at how we can build stronger, cohesive teams with meaningfulness around diversity, equity, inclusion, and also reframe those organizational narratives to tell those stories of impacts that keep human being people at the center of that work. And it's very important to also note that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a checklist. It's not something that we have to do. Many organizations prioritize it in terms of corporate social responsibility. Some also see that as a business strategic imperative that contributes to their overall growth as an organization. And then some people just also see it in terms of what it looks like to have something like that within an organization. Now, in talking about the fact that there is no such thing as a diverse individual, that brings us to the contextual nature of diversity. By describing or calling someone diverse, we imply that being different is something that is inherent to them, but being different is not inherent to people. People do find themselves in different groups, different classifications, but that's not something that is inherent to them. And when we use the word diverse or diverse individual to describe a person, then we're implying that there is a default, and that default is something that can be identified, something that can be labeled, and that individual is in direct conflict with that default, therefore reinforcing those dominant identities, which lead to reinforcement of workplace prejudice. So this is something that we want to be very careful about when we're dealing with understanding diversity. As I mentioned before, it's important that we kind of grasp the idea of how to foreground diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some terms to think about here would include things like inclusive dexterity. How do we become fluent in diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural competency integration? How do we arrive at inclusive languages, attention, awareness? How do we honor those differences that we have amongst our different staff and people that we work with? How do we develop that curiosity, that inquisitiveness that leaders are never done learning, sort of referring to that principle of always wanting to learn, being curious, and always wanting to know? My own nomadic experience, having traveled and lived in many different countries over the period of my life, and also had an opportunity to work in many organizations, helps me to understand that aspect of complexity and intersectionality when it comes to diversity. How do we honor all those different aspects of diversity? This is a call for a systemic and structural change within organizations. The need to create those empowering spaces where people can feel and know that they're empowered to bring their 100% true and authentic self to work, to know that they are supported, to know that they are understood, and to know that their views and opinions and contributions actually do matter. How do we look at that DEI lens over things like hiring, over things like recruitment? These are some problems areas that have come up in research to be issues that organizations continue to struggle with. And as we continue to move beyond that checking of the box, we've seen many of these Black Lives Matter movements, we've seen the Me Too movement, there have been quite a motion and a tremendous traction towards change. This is something that is really serious in our society today, and it should take priority in our organizations, considering the fact that we spend the majority of our time embedded within our individual organizations. There's a need to go deeper and examine those organizational processes, such as the strategies in place, that the strategy have multiple facets. Does it include the metrics of accountability that we need? Does it include key drivers? Do we have investment of senior leadership? What is the corporate position on DEI sponsorship? Because DEI as a lens definitely needs sponsorship within an organization. If we can create that empowering space that allows people to express themselves individually and avoid that organizational masking and actually feel like they belong. How do we have those active conversations around gender pronouns? How do we mediate those different strengths and challenges around color and all of those different burdens of trying to identify with diversity, equity, and inclusion? In implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion is no easy feat. Some of the key ways in which an organization can begin the process is to do a diversity and inclusion SWOT analysis, where you identify those strengths and weaknesses that are already in place within the organization. To identify how people feel within the organization, because we're going to need to build a constellation of consensus within our organization with organizational actors and employees. We want it to be a buy-in. We don't want it to be something that is embedded upon people where people feel like they're forced to participate in these integrations and these initiatives. We want it to be something that people champion and buy in together. How do we examine those hiring practices? By appealing to diverse applicants. And once we hire those diverse applicants, that's just the first step. How do we actually engage them and ensure their continued progress within the organization? There's a need for things like departmental inventories that can give you a sense of the climate within the organization, and it would also give you an insight into the voices that are within those organizations for us to be able to identify what the core issues are within those organizations. All of us, despite the best of our possible intentions, we are affected by some unconscious process. That's something that I want you to take away as a key insight here, is that we are all, despite our possibly good intentions, affected by unconscious processes. Now the question is, why does diversity matter at all? Why is this something that we have to pay attention to? Diversity, there's 21% is the rate at which gender diverse companies are more likely to outperform their competitors. 33% is the rate at which ethnically diverse companies are likely to outperform their competitors. 35% is the rate at which public companies with high diversity out-earn their competitors. And 45% of American employees are unaware of whether their companies actually have a diversity program in place or not. These are all very serious things to take that into account that affect the bottom line. And this was based on a meta-analysis study by McKinsey and Company. In looking at DEI, there are key domain and areas of focus that we can look at. This is based on the Lewin Group model study for cultural competency, where we look at things like organizational values, governance, planning and monitoring, communication, staff development, organizational infrastructure, services and interventions, and how all of these feed into that final process of the outcomes that we are seeking for the organization in terms of organization, clients, and then community. Finally, we'll be looking at what the framework of improvement looks like. How do we create those safe spaces of accountability for people who are evolving on the journey of improvement or competence on DEI issues? How do we help people better enhance their understanding and their knowledge around the terminology, the social identifiers, and create that space of authenticity, but one that is actually responsible, that does not harm people unintentionally? And how do we start to mediate those conversations around DEI and interrogate the different beliefs that people hold within organizations around DEI? The Boston Consulting Group did a study that came up with some of the key areas that they identified as things that people feel affect them at the workplace. The top three had to do with anti-discrimination policies, regular training for leadership, removing bias from evaluation and promotion decisions, women having flexibility within their work, people of color having participation in management and recruitment, and inequity issues around LGBTQ issues as well. We should strive to be an investor in people. We should always strive to make our workplace more diverse. The goal should be to get to a place where our team represents many cultures, because this has numerous benefits. And those diverse teams are also going to be more structured to solve complex problems, and also more well-situated to address those issues of the different groups that are arising, and more embedded with the commitment of investing in people and giving a chance to everybody to know that they matter and they belong in our organizations. So that is it, David.
Awesome. Thank you, Victor. I want to lead off by just asking you a question that is a little bit philosophical, but then we'll kind of get down into the more grounded area there. You made the really excellent point in the presentation regarding everybody has unconscious processes. And because of that, we have a default setting of what is normal for ourselves.
Mhm.
Can you give us some insight into how an individual or group might go about defining and identifying what their norms are? And I ask that because I think once people begin to recognize their norms, they're able to begin to engage diversity a little bit more effectively. So how might a group or individuals, begin to understand what is normative or normal for them in order to build off of that?
Okay. So group norms, first of all, would come from recognition, and it would also come from being intentional. And that intentionality is what would make you try to identify those easily identifiable or not so easily identifiable, more latent type guidelines or codes of behavior that are embedded within certain organizational practices and certain aspects of organizational behavior. There are certain standards that we may share as a group, things that we take for granted as a group. And these things may work to a very good extent when we're dealing with certain individuals within the group. But once we begin to start embracing other individuals within that group, then we need to start checking some of those assumptions. And as we check those assumptions, the key way would be to understand what those specific group norm assumptions that are being taken for granted are. And as we go through that introspective process of reflection, we'll be able to know that these norms prejudice in these ways. These norms stereotype in these ways. These norms disenfranchise in these ways, and these norms marginalize in these ways. And then we can begin that process of recovery and that process of improvement towards fixing those norms.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. I noticed with myself, Victor, a lot of times the clues for my own norms tend to pop out in my language, in the way in which I qualify certain things. So like, for instance, if I'm talking with someone and I said, so I was talking with this woman farmer and blah, 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 right there. Ding, 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 ding. My norm is a farmer is going to be a male, right? Or, I've heard people say, I was visiting, a black doctor and blah, blah, blah. And right there, they have a norm about what a doctor is. And so that was always helpful for me. And I continually, notice just in the way I say things, oh, that's what my norm is. And I wonder if you have found that in groups that even in just the way they talk about things, their norms kind of come to the surface.
Right, absolutely. I agree with you, David. You're 100% right about that. And those often are unconscious processes that do not come immediately to the forefront of our realization. And that was something that I touched on a little bit on the slide where I talked about making sure that we do not struggle to diverge from what the norm is and making sure that we avoid creating that default, because the default becomes the basis of disengaging, the basis of separation, the basis of discrimination in some cases, and even the basis of not being diversity, equity, and inclusion competent. So when we understand what those default norms are, those things that we take for granted in teams, which happens a lot, because there's so many of these processes that have been transferred down through patriarchal systems, through historicity, through historical record. There's such a huge traction of what has gone on for centuries that has led to the development of many of these norms. And it's important that we interrogate these taken for granted assumptions while trying to investigate or mediate around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. I'll invite the audience, if you have a question, feel free to fire that in on the Q&A tab down at the bottom of your screen. Another question for you, Victor, when you're working with organizations and they have made a really great attempt at beginning to tackle their diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, where do you often see them kind of fall down as they try to go further with that? I understand how easy it is for someone to invite someone in to do a DEI presentation, to engage the group, but where are the real bottlenecks? Where are the places where where organizations do not go far enough and aren't able to maintain their DEI momentum.
Okay, great. So let's keep that word momentum in mind and let's explore that a little bit further. When we are thinking about bringing in, it could be a consultant, it could be even an internal body or committee that we establish to solve these DEI issues. We want to avoid a situation where people are sort of receiving training, because that training becomes sort of like a band-aid. It becomes sort of like a plaster. And what happens is once people are done with the training, they're like, oh, okay, what are your key takeaway? Are there any aha moments that you can benefit from or reflect upon? But once that is done, it's like you're moving forward. So we want to talk about moving from a place of initiation to a place of integration. So how do we make that transfer process possible by taking in what we feel are integral aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion, and making it an imperative within the organization. One of the first things to deal with there as an organization is having that shared purpose. You don't want to have any sort of silos there where people are thinking differently within the organizations, which is why it's so important that DEI initiatives affect all aspects of organization. It's something that should be identified in the core mission of the organization. It should be identified in the vision of the organization. It should be identified in the policies. It should be identified in the practices. And when we see that it's completely embedded and we're looking at things from that framework and from that lens of inclusivity, then it becomes easy for you to have those quality conversations. It becomes easy for you to buy those champions within organizations. And as senior leaderships take an active presence and an active role in driving these initiatives forward, it becomes easier for the organization as a whole to embrace that.
Yeah, interesting thought there, Victor. We have an audience question that is right kind of on that same line of thought. Do you find in your work that the subject of DEI is so big and such a buzzword right now that companies are just trying to check the box instead of creating systemic change? And do you find that the size of the company trying to make changes has more or less success? So does it matter the size of the organization, and also how are people moving past that?
Yeah, the size of the organization matters, because I guess the size of the organization could impact what you have as far as human resources to drive that initiative forward. It could also have fiscal impacts of what the organizational position in as far as revenue, and also make an impact in terms of how much they're trying to dedicate in terms of money towards solving this problem. Is this just a donation towards a particular campaign, a donation towards a particular initiative, one that can be covered by the press, and then you can have that good press, and then you can just kind of check the box that you did something and you participated in it? Or is it an active, ongoing process that is central to the company's strategic business imperatives? So for organizations to be successful in this way, organizations need to understand the different experiences, the different perspectives, and the different approaches to solving the complex problems that an organization already has. And then how do we target those different aspects of diversity to be able to touch on those distinct markets, such as we're talking about women markets, ethnic minorities, we're talking about LGBTQ communities, and they are beginning to command such an increasing share of consumer wealth, which could represent untapped markets for some companies. And this is something that we cannot overlook as organizations that want to grow. And then there's also the aspect of competitive advantages coming from things that diverse groups are able to solve in terms of innovation, in terms of problem solving, value creation, and growth. These are some of the two key indicators for CEOs if they're trying to make the organization strive.
Yeah. Victor, if you were to leave the audience with one next step thought, let's imagine that you're talking to organizational leaders who have done some DEI work. So they've done some DEI training, maybe they have an initiative in their organization. What would be one thing that would be really important for them to think about in maintaining and sustaining those DEI initiatives?
Okay, so what I would say would be we should pay attention to both the qualitative and quantitative aspects of DEI initiatives. So with regards to the qualitative aspects, we'll be looking at things like storytelling. We want to be investigating those hermeneutics that are within the organization. We want to know those personal stories that organizations have. We want to get to the bottom of people's lived organizational experiences and how that impacts them as organizational individuals and also impacts them as individuals in general. And then from a quantitative standpoint, we want to be able to look at specifics, metrics of development, metrics of accountability. And by assessing those specific metrics and how DEI can contribute to the overall growth strategy of an organization, we would have that total understanding of how the qualitative measures and the quantitative measures can come together to drive DEI within an organization.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for that, Victor. And thanks for your time today. We appreciate you being on the webinar. There's a lot of helpful elements in kind of going beyond our basic DEI training. So thanks for being with us.
Yes, it was an absolute joy to be here, David, and I enjoyed the questions from the audience too as well.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, for audience at home, folks, feel free to check out the Exec Ed website for more information about our programs. You can do so by simply Googling Exec Ed University of Denver, and you will find a recording of this webinar and the dozens of others that we have done over the past year there. DEI trainings are an important part of nearly all of our custom programs. And by custom here, we mean that in a literal sense. Every single project that we do in our custom programming is tailored for a particular client and a particular client's needs. And so if you're interested in finding out more about custom programs, please track us down at Exec Ed. We're happy to be a resource for you. Also, we will continue to run the Accelerate webinars throughout the rest of the year, so please look for them on our website or on LinkedIn. Our next webinar will be June 3rd when Scott McLagan will be teaching on leadership strategies for dealing with uncertainty. You can register for that webinar and watch all past episodes on the website. We also recognize that summertime means you're out on the road or trail, and we're, as we did last time, we're pleased to announce that we're going to begin to convert some of the past webinars to podcasts for your listening enjoyment while you're out and about. And so look forward to that coming from us in June. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We hope you gain new insight that will accelerate your impact in your community, your organization, and the world. From the University of Denver Daniels College of Business Executive Education Division, we look forward to seeing you again in another Accelerate webinar. Thanks for being with us, everybody.